Hey nerds, what's up? So today I'm going to be doing my October wrap-up and November TBR. Let's get started. I wish I could take all the things I said in mine. These are all the books that I was planning on reading. I got through all of them and all of that jazz. The book I read this month was The Abundance of Catherines by John Green, and this one I read through the library but on my e-reader, so I don't have it with me. I liked this book. It definitely had a different kind of writing style than I'm used to. It was still definitely John Green, but the premise of the story is that the main character is a prodigy, or he just learns things really fast, but he wants to be a genius, and rarely does a prodigy turn out to be a genius. And so he's got this whole complex, and then on top of that he's only ever dated Catherine, spelled K-A-T-H-E-R-I-N-E, and so there's this whole thing. And throughout the story there are things that he says or that his friend says that isn't necessarily something the layman would know, and instead of explaining in the book they give you a little number, and then at the end of each chapter they tell you what those things are. And I liked that, but I wish I had been reading an actual book so that I could flip back, look at what the reference was, and then read what it meant, or as I'm reading flip to the end of the chapter and read what it means while I'm reading, because reading them after I couldn't always remember what they were talking about in those numbers because they didn't reiterate what the reference was. So that was a little bit of a bummer, but I did really like the story. I really liked the love interest, which it's been so long now since the beginning of the month that I can't remember anyone's names. Her name isn't Catherine. It was an interesting story. I enjoyed it. The next book that I picked up is a non-fiction book, and that is The Statues That Walked by Terry Hunt and Carl Lippo. And this was a book that I had to read for my archaeology class. One of these men is my professor. It's Carl Lippo. I have him this semester, so he made us read this, and it was an interesting read. It's about it's unraveling the mystery of Easter Island, or Rapa Nui. So if you've ever heard of Easter Island, you know kind of about the statues. Basically, there's these statues on Easter Island, and the reason it's called Easter Island, which its actual name is Rapa Nui, but the reason it's called Easter Island is because one of the first Europeans to ever get there and talk about the people who already are there landed on Easter Sunday. So yeah. And so this book is about what Carl Lippo and Terry Hunt researched while they were on Rapa Nui about the moai, which are what these statues are called. And basically they've discovered that the way that these statues were moved across the island into where the people wanted them to be is by walking them. And basically the statue is made so that it's kind of leaning forward until they get to the place, and then they change that. But so they're built so that they're leaning forward, and then all they have to do is tie ropes on the top of the huge statues and then very easily move them this way, and then as they pull them and the statues are leaning, they're leaning forward, and so they're kind of waddling forward. So that was the main thing that this book was researching and talking about. And they did a bunch of other research too that they go into, but that was the main premise of this book. It was a rather interesting read, and I'm not usually a huge fan of archaeology books. I like the anthropology and the bone anthropology stuff better usually, but good stuff. The next book I read was for Little Book Owl's book club, the Little Book Club on Goodreads. So you can check out that group on Goodreads if you want to, and it's hosted by Little Book Owl, or Catriona. I can never say her name and I feel so terrible. But the live show for this book is on November 16th. Pacific Standard Time. It's at 2 p.m. so I'm not sure what that is for you, and I'm really hoping I get picked for the live show, but it hasn't been announced yet. This was one of my favorite books I read this last month. It was really good. I loved the premise, which is about Victor and Eli, who 10 years ago were best friends. And even then though, like, how Victor, it's in Victor's point of view, how Victor describes their friendship is a pretty toxic friendship. But they're both seniors and they're writing their thesis, and Eli decides to write his thesis on EOs, or extraordinaries, basically superhuman people, and to see if they're real and how can you make one or be one, or who are they? Is it a genetic thing or what? And so yeah, Eli and Victor end up helping each other. Well, Victor ends up helping Eli with this research project, and they find out that they can make themselves EOs, and so they do. And then 10 years later, which is present day, we are stuck in this place where Victor has broken out of prison a day ago, and he's on the run, and he's got this 13-year-old girl with her and his cellmate who helped him escape, and he helped escape as well. His name's Mitch, and they're digging up a grave. And that's where the story kind of starts off. And obviously I'm not going to give you any more than that, but it was definitely an entertaining ride. I loved the superhero aspect along with the real aspect. It was a very real story, even though obviously there's supernatural things happening. The 13-year-old girl I mentioned, I want to say her name is Sydney. I really liked her, but out of everyone, I definitely loved Mitch the best, which is the cellmate. He has no superpowers whatsoever. He was awesome. And I also felt like the antagonists, the two of them, Eli and Serena, who is Sydney's sister, were amazing. They were just beautifully written evil characters, and the reasons behind them being evil were undeniably wrong, but in a really well-written way. And yeah, the writing was amazing in this story. This is by V.E. Schwab, or Victoria Schwab. And yeah, definitely recommend this one. I will be doing a review on this book, so stay tuned for that. It should be the next video that's coming up. Then I picked up Wonder by R.J. Palacio, and I buddy read this with Chrissy from CT Wood 09, and we met through the YouTuber reviewers group on Goodreads, so if you want to check out that group, you can just search it on Goodreads if you have a channel of your own and want to check it out. It's pretty cool. I read this book. It was very adorable. When I bought this book, I really didn't know what it was about. I just knew that I've heard really good things about it. Going into actually starting the book, I only read, you know, the front flap, which basically says that August Pullman, who is the main character, is going into 5th grade, and he's homeschooled, so he's never been to a real school before, and he has some sort of facial deformity, and you don't really know what it is. And for the first part, there's like 6 parts in it. For the first part, you have no idea what August looks like. He won't explain what he looks like because he says whatever you're thinking, it's probably worse. And so basically this is just a really lovely story about kind of how to get through school, being a new kid on its own by itself, like that's bad enough, and how to get through that, and how to make friends that really matter, and all of the, you know, normal kind of school age books that you would read. But on top of that, you know, he's got a facial deformity, so he's got even worse kind of bullying happening to him and how he deals with that. And it's just such a lovely story. And we also get, my favorite part is we get his sister, Olivia or Via, we get her point of view in this story, which I thought was fascinating to hear, not just from the kid who has the facial deformity, but from the sister who is also dealt with having a brother with a facial deformity since she was very young, and so she's had to deal with people being mean to her for having a brother who looks weird also. And I thought that was an interesting take on it, and I'm glad that they showed us that point of view. So RJ Palacio, good job on this one. I read Black Ice by Becca Fitzpatrick, which is the Booksplosion book of the month this month in October. A lot of people had issues with this book, and I didn't have as many issues as they did. After watching a lot of reviews, I really was entertained by the story, and yes, it had issues, and yes, like the characters were not as well thought out as they could have been, and all of that good stuff that all of these people are complaining about, but like I just was entertained, and it was one of those stories where you could turn your brain off and just don't try to think too hard and read into things, but just enjoy the ride, because it definitely was a riveting story. There were moments where I was worried and scared at reading it, but then it was also just like this story of adventure, and that was great. And then of course the epilogue is a happy-go-lucky moment, and to me I loved that because it's cheesy but good. Like, yeah. Anyway, I know I had some issues with it, and I know a lot of people did have issues with it, but I would still recommend reading it as long as you don't think too hard about it. Like, it's entertaining, and isn't that what we're kind of reading for sometimes? Like, and it was a good October Halloween read, which is when I was reading this book, so that was nice too. And I flew through it. Like, This book is almost 400 pages long, and I read it in like 4 days because I just couldn't put it down because it was so entertaining. And that is my October wrap-up. So that is everything I read in October. I technically finished Black Ice November 2nd or something like that. But now into the TBR. So, November. My list is of 4.5 books. Now I say that because there is a 5th book I want to add onto the list, but I don't know what that book is yet. So, let's get into this. The first book that I have already picked up here in November is Mockingjay by Suzanne Collins. This book I will be spoiling because I've already read it, so if you want to skip it, this is the number to go to the next book here, but I do recommend this series. So go here if you don't want to be spoiled by the end of the Hunger Games trilogy and on to the next book. This is my least favorite book in the series, but I wanted to reread it because November 20th, Mockingjay Part 1 comes out, so I wanted it fresh in my mind so I could really remember, and I wanted to try to guess when they're going to cut the movie in half. I think that they will be splitting Mockingjay Part 1 and Part 2 at the moment when Peeta is saved and he sees Katniss and he tries to strangle her. I think that's where they'll cut it. That's my theory. I am already almost done with this book. I'm on page 322 and it's only like 388 pages or something because, oh my god, this book is so good. I hated this book the first time I read it, and I think that part of the problem was with a lot of people who read this series was they were expecting a Hunger Games Part 3 because Hunger Games and Catching Fire were really similar. You still go into the games. It's very exciting. Everything's happening. Like, there's non-stop action, and then you get here and it's a lot of sitting around and waiting to know things. And I found that reading it a second time through and already knowing that it wasn't going to be as exciting, I was able to really enjoy everything that Katniss is going through and like the relationship development between Katniss and Prim, because we already know Katniss loves her sister, but we really get to know Prim a little bit more in this story, which is of course depressing after already reading it. Sorry, this is like spoilers. Of course, reading, you know, Prim and getting to know her a little bit more after knowing that she's going to die is really, really sad, but I think it really adds depth to this book. And oh my god, I didn't remember that Fiddick dies, and I just got to that part and so sad. The next book I plan on picking up is the Twistrose Key, and I can't remember the author of this book, but here it is. This is Little Book Owl's book club book, so that's what that is. But I'm really interested in reading this book. I believe it's by a Norwegian author because Norway was the theme of this month's book picking. So yeah, I'm really excited to read this book. This was the one that I voted for, so I'm glad it got picked. The next book that I'm planning on picking up is Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn, and I have the little baby version here because that was the only one that my bookstore had available when I bought it. But I'm so excited to read this. I've already seen the movie, so I know the storyline obviously, but I'm really excited to read it. I am not any less ready to read this book. It sounds so good. After knowing the plot, I'm just so excited to get into this. Ooh, it's gonna be exciting. The next book I want to pick up is actually a nonfiction book. It's called Newsfail. It's written by Jamie Kilstein and Allison Kilkenny, which are the two hosts of the podcast called Citizen Radio. It is one of my favorite podcasts. It's a daily through Monday through Friday podcast, and it is a news podcast. It's independent news, that's what they call themselves, because they're independent. They're not owned by any sort of network, and they give you the news. And I really enjoy this podcast, and I really enjoy them. I think they're hilarious. Jamie Kilstein is also a comedian and an improvisational actor, or comedian, however you want to say. And Allison Kilkenny is a journalist and also dabbles in the improv and comedian arts. So the podcast is funny and all of that stuff, and they recently wrote their first book, so I'm excited to pick that up. I've heard really good things. Obviously, they've been promoting it a shit ton on their podcast. So yeah, I will be picking that up hopefully this month. Cross my fingers. And the last book that I definitely plan on reading will probably be the Booksplosion Book of the Month book, but I don't know what it is, so I can't tell you, but if I know by the time this comes up, it will be right here. It's right there. So yeah, that's the 5 books that I definitely plan on reading this month. However, I am also going to be driving 4.5 hours up to my grandma's house in Central California for Thanksgiving. So I probably will end up picking up more books than this, and then there's a whole 4.5 hours drive back down. So I might buy an audiobook, or I might just read a book. I haven't decided because it depends on if I end up driving or not. That is my entire October wrap-up and November TBR. Make sure to check out all my social media links down below. This is the link also for all of them, especially if you want to check out what I'm reading right at this moment, and we can talk about it if you're reading it or if you've read it, and you know, all that good stuff. And make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!